Hello, everyone. It's great to be back with you. As you may remember, I'm Dr. Rick Bedlack, and I'm a professor of neurology and director of the ALS program at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, in the United States. And I'm here today to help you untangle methylcobalamin as an ALS treatment option, and also to update you on some of the work that my team is doing here at Duke University. I'll start with some disclosures. I do have research funding now from the ALS Association and from Orion, Medicinova, and the Healy Center. And I also have consulting support for several companies, which you can see listed here. Mainly what I do for these companies is help them try to design trials and expanded access programs that are more patient-centric, and also serve as a member of their data safety monitoring boards to try to help ensure the safety of patients who are participating in their trials. So again, what I thought I would do today is help you to untangle methylcobalamin as a possible ALS treatment, and then update you on some of the work we're doing here. And specifically, I thought I would update you on three things: clenbuterol, neurophoresis, and our ALS reversals research programs. And so whenever someone asks me about what I call an alternative or off-label treatment, which methylcobalamin would be, the first place I go is to my ALS Untangled website. And as you may know, you can get to this website several ways: www.alsuntangled.com, .org, or .net. And when you go there, you'll come to this main page, and you'll see that there's sort of three parts to it. First, you can learn about how we review things like this. Second, you can look under completed reviews to read some of our reviews. And then finally, if there's nothing there that you're looking for, you can look under future reviews and see if we've already heard about your idea. And if not, you can send it to us and it'll get posted there. So in this case, if we go to the completed reviews section and we scroll down, and you have to scroll down quite a ways, there's actually now close to 67 different reviews that we've published. You will eventually find methylcobalamin. And if you click on the name, it'll bring up the article that we originally wrote back in 2015. And if there's been an update since then, which in this case there has, and you can tell by the little asterisks and by this comment that we updated this in May of 2022, you'll see what's new since we wrote about it. But the first thing you probably want to do when you go there to read about a product like this is figure out what the product is. And so in this case, in the review that we wrote, you can read this paragraph: cobalamin, which is also known as B12. It's a water-soluble vitamin. It's really important in a lot of things that our bodies need to do: DNA synthesis, fatty acid and amino acid metabolism, the formation of blood cells, and the normal function of the nervous system. Human beings cannot make this cobalamin, and therefore we have to acquire it either through our diets or through supplements, which can be oral or injected. If cobalamin is taken orally, it requires a special process in the stomach, pancreas, and small bowel to be absorbed. And so there's a lot of different ways you can become deficient in cobalamin or B12. Most commonly, it's because of impaired absorption, but it can also be poor intake. And if you become deficient, you can get fatigue, you can get low red blood cells, you can have trouble with memory, you can become confused, you can get neuropathy, your spinal cord can start to degenerate. Now, there's many different forms of cobalamin. The most common supplement is cyanocobalamin, and that is the one that most commonly is taken orally or injected. That is not an active form of the vitamin. The body has to convert it before it can be used. Methylcobalamin is already an active form. It doesn't require any further conversion. And so with ALS Untangled, we review every idea across 5 different categories: the mechanism, what is it supposed to do, and does that make any sense based on what we know about the biology of ALS? The preclinical data: has this thing ever been given to any ALS models? The case reports: what happened to people that we know of who took this for ALS? The trials, and then finally the risks. And so we give a grade ranging from A, which is the best grade we can give, all the way out to F. And again, sometimes the grades are revised based on new information. So here you see the revised grades for methylcobalamin. We got an A for mechanism, a C for preclinical, a D for cases, an A for trials, and a D for risks. So why did we give it those grades? Well, mechanism, because we can actually measure that methylcobalamin supplements lower something that we think is important in ALS biology, and that is something called homocysteine. And so we've seen in human trials that supplements, methylcobalamin supplements, lower this biomarker, which is associated with worsened ALS progression. We gave it a C for preclinical, and that's because there are multiple reports of methylcobalamin being given to ALS animal models, and these seem to generally be positive, but those studies had flaws. For example, some of them were very small, many of them were not blinded, and that's why we gave it a C. We gave case reports a D because we did find multiple patients online and also in our clinics who were using methylcobalamin supplements. Some of them did report subjective benefits. They felt better on it, but we couldn't confirm those benefits with any kind of data we were able to get our hands on. Originally, we gave it a trials grade of D, but we upgraded that to an A. And the reason is, since our first publication, there now have been 2 pretty good randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials in which patients with ALS were given methylcobalamin at a dose of 50 milligrams intramuscular injection twice a week. And both of these studies basically showed the same thing, that those supplements were associated with a pretty significantly slower ALS progression as measured by the ALS functional rating scale compared to patients treated with placebo. Now, what's really important is there was only a subset of patients in both trials that showed benefit. These were patients in the first 12 months of their ALS symptoms who were progressing at least an average rate. So for patients who had the disease longer than 12 months, or patients who were progressing really slow or really fast, there's no evidence that this has any benefits. And then finally, for risks, we gave it a grade of B, which is actually quite good. And the reason is there are some side effects that can be associated with intramuscular injections, pain, swelling, bruising, but we didn't find any serious side effects from this treatment. Now, I will say several of my patients over the past couple of years have asked for this. In our country, you can only get intramuscular methylcobalamin with a prescription. And the only place I know of to get it is from a compounding pharmacy. And it turns out to take that dose of 50 milligrams intramuscular twice a week, it's not easy. So 50 milligrams is not available as a single injection. In fact, you need to give yourself 3 injections to get up to 50 milligrams. And so it's a burden. It's got some pain associated with it. It's fairly expensive. So in this country, it's a few $100s a month to get that much methylcobalamin. Plus, you got to pay extra for the injection supplies. So moving on to the second part of the talk, which is some of the things that we're doing here at Duke. So one of the nice things about being here is I'm surrounded by really smart people who are doing things in other diseases that I want to borrow for my patients in my clinic. And one of those things is clenbuterol. So clenbuterol belongs to a class of medication called beta agonists. These are used to treat asthma in many countries around the world. They're not FDA approved, so they're not used for anything in the United States, at least not legally. Many Americans have heard of clenbuterol because a lot of us are sports fans, and several high-profile athletes have tested positive for clenbuterol, or clen, as they call it, and therefore been suspended from their sport. Now, why would an athlete want to use an asthma drug? Well, it turns out it does other things, including stimulating muscle growth by stimulating something called insulin-like growth factor. And so athletes use it because it can make your muscles bigger and stronger. That's cheating in sports, but exactly what we want in a disease like ALS. And so this was actually brought to my attention by one of my pediatric neurology colleagues who was testing it in kids with muscular dystrophy and having some good results. And as I started to look into this, I found some surprising things. First, back in 2006, an Italian group had actually given this to the ALS mouse model and found improvements in motor function and survival. And second, an Italian neurologist had actually studied this in 16 patients in his clinic. He used a very small dose, 20 micrograms 3 times a day. This is what's referred to as a case series. There wasn't any control group. He just gave it to 16 patients and then just reported out what happened. What happened was pretty interesting. So here is a table from his paper. And first, we can look at the myometry scores in the upper limb and the lower limb. So this is sort of a composite measure of strength. And you can see that over the course of 6 months, time 0 are the scores at enrollment. Time 2 is after 6 months of treatment with clenbuterol. On average, this group of patients was stronger than they were when they started. We hardly ever see that in an ALS trial. And we can also look at the measure of breathing, the forced vital capacity. And again, on average, people's forced vital capacity had gone up over 6 months. So we're not talking about a slower progression. We're talking about an actual improvement in this group of patients over 6 months, which we hardly ever see. And it seemed like, at least at these doses, clenbuterol was safe and well tolerated, not only in this, but in many other human trials across many different diseases. And so I partnered with this neurologist whose name is Dr. Dwight Koebel, and we did a small trial in my patients with ALS. We made this a widely inclusive trial. We studied 25 people living with ALS, and everybody got clenbuterol. And, at Dr. Koebel's direction, we decided to really push the dose because he thought patients could tolerate much higher doses. At least his pediatric patients could. And so we actually tapered all the way up to 80 micrograms twice a day, much higher than what the Italian groups had used. And we used sort of classic ALS outcome measures, ALS functional rating scale, breathing, strength testing, and safety labs. And we compared how each person in the trial did during 6 months of clenbuterol treatment to how they were doing before. And we tried to make this as easy for patients as we could. 4 in-person visits over 6 months. All the rest were telephone visits. And what we found was interesting. So first, we had a lot of dropouts. Now, part of that was because we opened this right at the beginning of the global COVID-19 pandemic, but part of it was also because there were a lot more side effects than we had hoped to see. Cramps, tremors, palpitations, insomnia. So we only had 11 of the 25 people still in the study at the end of 6 months. But I have to say, for those 11, the results were pretty interesting. Every single one of them was progressing slower on treatment than they were before treatment. And 5 of them, half, actually had positive ALS functional rating scale slopes during clenbuterol treatment, meaning it appeared that they were regaining lost function. If we look at the group as a whole, we saw about a 70% slowing in the rate of progression on the ALS FRSR score and about a 90% slowing on the rate of decline in breathing measurements. These results are, to me, pretty impressive compared to what we typically see, which is more like a 20 to 30% slowing in a positive trial. Now, of course, there are ways to criticize this study. It's very small. There was a lot of dropout. It wasn't randomized. It wasn't blinded. It wasn't placebo-controlled. But in my opinion, given the plausible mechanisms, the positive animal data, the positive case series from Italy, and now this, we really need to find a way to move clenbuterol into a larger, more traditional phase 2 trial. And we're trying to do some fundraising to get that going. It's not going to be easy. At least here, a phase 2 trial would cost somewhere between $10 and $15 million. Just to give you some framework, this trial, which was funded by a patient's family, cost $200,000. So it's a big jump in funding. Another really interesting idea that was brought to me by a colleague is called neurophoresis. So Dr. Nandan Ladd here at Duke, a neurosurgeon, has invented a device that can filter spinal fluid. And he's using this in a trial for patients who have subarachnoid hemorrhage, bleeding into their spinal fluid. And, he thinks that by removing the red blood cells, he may be able to improve outcomes in people with this condition. Now, why would we think about using this in ALS? Well, one of the things that's intrigued me for a long time is it looks like the spinal fluid from people with ALS is toxic. If we take that spinal fluid and we put it on cells in a dish, like, for example, astrocytes or microglia, we can change their function. We can make their function pathological. And most impressively, if we take the spinal fluid from a person with ALS and inject it into the spinal fluid of a mouse, the mouse gets an ALS-like disease. Now, we don't know exactly what's in there. A lot of groups have theories. One very plausible theory is that it's a small molecule in the class of something called a cytokine or a chitin. Now, these molecules are much smaller than blood cells, and so we don't know whether this filter can actually remove them. And so we designed sort of a three-part way to study this. Part number one was just to get spinal fluid samples from 5 of my patients and run it through this filter on the desk, and see what we filter out. And part two was to compare filtered versus unfiltered spinal fluid in mice or rats to see, can we actually remove the toxicity with the filter? And if we can do that, then we hope to be able to get funding to do a small pilot trial next year. And so just to show you the most dramatic of the experiments that we've done so far, this is a side view, a cartoon view of a mouse's head. Their eyeball would be up here. And this is the back of their head. And this is the tiny little space that the neurosurgeons are able to inject spinal fluid into. And the assay that we have is we put the mouse into a box, a plexiglass box, and then we just videotape what it does. And so if you take a normal healthy mouse and you put him in a plexiglass box, the mouse is curious and he walks all around the box, exploring every part of it. Now, if you take a mouse and you inject unfiltered spinal fluid from a person with ALS, you can see that the mouse's head moves. It seems like it's still curious, but it doesn't seem to be able to get around the box very well. Now, if you take a different mouse and you inject filtered spinal fluid, you restore what appears to be normal curiosity behaviors, normal movements around the box. And so you can actually look at this a couple different ways. You can draw cartoons to trace what the mouse did. And again, you can see the healthy mouse and the mouse that got filtered spinal fluid are pretty similar, but the mouse that got unfiltered spinal fluid doesn't move around very much. And so we now know that we can filter a lot of these small molecules, and we know that we can remove the toxicity of spinal fluid with the filter. So now we're in the process of trying to get all the protocols and permissions and funds that we need to take this filter into a small human trial next year. And then last but not least, just to update you on what we're doing with these ALS reversals. So if you haven't heard of an ALS reversal, it's something that was new to me 10 years ago when I first ran into one. There are people out there that appear to meet diagnostic criteria for ALS, progress to where they're disabled, and then make an unexpected and dramatic recovery of their lost motor function. So this has actually been reported in the medical literature multiple times, dating all the way back to the 1960s. It's just that no one ever systematically collected and studied these cases before. And that's what I'm trying to do with my Duke team. And we believe we now have 58 of these, and we're studying them in every way that we can. The reason is there's a precedent for studying patients who are unexpectedly resistant to a disease and then having the results of those studies lead to better treatments for everyone. And the most famous example of that is the HIV elite controllers. You know, it was recognized that there was a group of people who got infected with HIV, but never got sick. And for a long time, people just reported these cases and that was that. And then someone decided to gather them all together and study them. And lo and behold, by studying them, they found a pathway that they never knew HIV needed to make people sick. And Pfizer jumped on that pathway and built a drug that helps everyone with HIV. And so we've got two types of studies going on. One are what we call STAR studies, study of ALS reversals. And there we're collaborating with people all over the world to see what's different about these people. We're looking at images of their brains and spinal cords. We're looking at their genetics. We're looking at their RNA and their proteins. We're looking at their microbiome. We're looking at what they might have been exposed to. And someday, if these patients die, hopefully not for a long time from natural causes, we hope to be able to look at their autopsies and compare what these folks look like to people with more typically progressive ALS. And if you want a detailed update of these studies, we'll be presenting that next week on a webinar for a group called Everything ALS. And then the other way that we're studying them is through something called replication of ALS reversals. These are small pilot trials of some of the products, the AOTs, that are associated with these cases. Now, because most of these products are very safe, they're supplements like methylcobalamine, and because we're looking for such a huge signal, we're looking for ALS reversals. We're trying to see if we can create more ALS reversals. We're not looking for a 20 or 30% slowing. The trials that we do in this program look very different than your typical pharmaceutical company sponsored trial. These are wide open. Almost anybody can be in these trials. We don't use any placebos. We use historical controls. We don't have any in-person visits anymore in these trials. They're all virtual visits, and the results are available in real time by partnering with a group called Patients Like Me. We also publish our protocols that we're using, so patients who can't participate in one of these ROAR trials can follow the protocol with their own doctor. And so, as you may know, we've already done a couple of these now. First one we did was a ROAR trial of something called Lunasin, a peptide that comes from soybeans that we thought had really plausible mechanisms and was associated with a dramatic recovery from bulbar ALS. And there was some good news and some bad news that came out of that ROAR Lunasin trial. The bad news was the product. It didn't seem to work. It didn't seem to alter histone acetylation. It didn't seem to slow, stop, or reverse anyone's ALS. And in fact, it wasn't even as safe and well tolerated as we thought it would be. Most people in this trial had side effects, including cases of constipation that were so severe we had to hospitalize people. The good news was the design worked really well. This was the fastest enrolling trial in the history of ALS. Most trials enroll about 2 patients per site per month. This enrolled more than 9. The people in this study looked much more like a typical clinic population. And the importance of that is, most of the time when we do a pharma-sponsored trial, the people who participated, they don't represent the typical clinic population. But in these studies, they do. And therefore, we feel like if we get a good result, it's much more likely to generalize. And we also showed that people could be taught to measure things, and they would measure them, and they would record them accurately throughout the whole study. So we just finished up our second ROAR trial. We just got the results of this literally 2 weeks ago. And once again, we had some good news and some bad news. This was a trial of something called theracurmin, a water-soluble form of curcumin that had lots of plausible mechanisms. It was actually associated with 9 different ALS reversals. Unfortunately, this product didn't work either. It didn't appear to slow, stop, or reverse anyone's ALS. But in spite of this trial, enrolling in the middle of a pandemic, it still enrolled better than most traditional ALS trials. We also retained patients pretty well. 70% of those that were still alive at the end of the study were still in the trial. Again, we had a very diverse and more real-world type study population. And so we're getting ready now to launch our third ROAR trial. And this one's going to have a new wrinkle. This will be called the ROAR Genius trial. And that's because we're partnering with a group in Australia called Genius. And in addition to sort of the design features of theracurmin, we're going to integrate something they've invented called Deep Integrated Genomics Analysis Platform, or DIGAP. So DIGAP is a way to look at all the genetic information from an individual patient. So not just to look for genes that cause ALS, but to look for things that we call single nucleotide variants, small structural variants, repeat expansions, copper number variants, and transposable elements, which may in and of themselves typically be thought of as variants of unknown significance. But by looking at the whole genetic picture of a person, Genius believes they can categorize people into 4 groups based on the biology that is most likely driving their ALS progression: neuroinflammation, oxidative stress, disrupted intracellular transport and autophagy, and mitochondrial dysfunction. In other words, we feel like this platform may allow us to personalize the treatments that we give each patient. And so once people are consented and enroll, their blood will be sent off to Genius. It'll take a couple of months, but we will get back their categorization. And based on their categorization, they will be given a product that is associated with that pathway. It is known to affect that pathway at dosages that are safe, and a product that is also associated with an ALS reversal. So not everyone in this trial will get the same product. There'll be some personalization. The 4 products are still being discussed. We're narrowing it down, but we're very excited about this new wrinkle in this trial that will open in 2023. So just to conclude, I've shown you that you can learn a lot about products like methylcobalamin with ALS Untangled. Specific to that product, methylcobalamin at a dosage of 50 milligrams intramuscular injection twice a week may slow disability in a specific subset of patients who have average progression and are in the first 12 months of their symptoms. So if you look like that, it may be something to consider. Talk to your own doctor about it. If you don't look like that, which most patients unfortunately do not, then there's no evidence that it helps. We've got some exciting things going on here at Duke, clenbuterol and neurophoresis. We have exciting early data on those, and we hope to bring those into larger trials soon. And we're also collecting and studying ALS reversals. And we feel like if we can understand why these happen, we might soon be able to make them happen more often. So thanks to all of you out there listening who are living with ALS. I hope you understand you're the inspiration for all this work that I'm doing. Thanks to all of our funding sources, our collaborators around the world, and my Duke ALS care team for building a foundation of great patient care upon which all these ideas are based. So I'll end the presentation now, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Excellent presentation, Richard. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's no surprise that it was excellent, because you gave us another wonderful presentation 2 years ago. So you share some very exciting news and some very interesting updates on methylcobalamin and other products and other projects. So vitamins is always a hot topic, right? Because it looks like something that can be easily accessed and in a way affordable, because you can find all kinds of supplements in any pharmacy. So people have been talking about vitamin B, vitamin D, vitamin E also for a very long time. What is your take on that? What can we recommend people in terms of vitamin supplements?
Yeah. And as you know, I've for the past 13 years, spent just about every night and weekend reading about this whole group of products that I refer to as alternative and off-label treatments. And those would include, vitamins and nutritional supplements and even prescription drugs that might be used to treat ALS off-label. It seems like there's tens of thousands of these out there, and certainly understand why people living with ALS are interested in these. I would be interested in these if I had ALS. And I have to say, some of them appear much more promising than others. And so typically asked about vitamins. What I would say is that the vitamins that I'm most excited about, number one, specifically within the B vitamins, is this methylcobalamin. And again, I think there's now, 2 clinical trials, well-designed trials, that show that this can help a very specific subset of people living with ALS. But there's no evidence that it helps anyone else other than that subset. In fact, specifically in those trials, people who had disease for longer than a year did not show any benefit from that treatment. And, sadly, we hardly ever see anyone in our clinic who's in the first 12 months of their symptoms. I might see 1% of people who are that early. So for that 1%, I do mention this stuff. But for the other 99%, it's pretty clear from those studies that there's no evidence of benefit. There's no evidence of benefit for any other B vitamin. So, sometimes people look at, how difficult it's going to be to inject this vitamin, or how much it's going to cost. And they say, well, I'll just take it orally, or I'll just take, a B complex. No evidence that those things help. In fact, B complex, there's something in there called B6. B6 at high levels can actually be toxic including to the nervous system. So when it comes to B vitamins, the only one I've seen any benefits for is injected methylcobalamin, and only for that subset of patients. Other vitamins, vitamin D. So there is actually a study out there suggesting that people with ALS are more likely to be vitamin D deficient, D as in Donald. And if they are vitamin D deficient, they might progress faster. And there's other health benefits associated with having a normal vitamin D level. For example, there's some studies that suggest that if you fall with low D, you're more likely to break bones. Not every study shows that, but some do. And so for these reasons, I check vitamin D in everyone who comes to my clinic. And if it's low, I supplement them into the normal range. I think that's really easy and really safe to do. When it comes to other vitamins, I would say vitamin E is probably the most commonly prescribed, not only of all vitamins, but of all alternative and off-label treatments across the world. More than half of the people who come to my clinic from other clinics have been told to take vitamin E. It's also probably the single most studied of all the products that we've ever reviewed in the history of ALS on Tangle. It does not work, does not slow, stop, or reverse ALS. Now, another interesting question about it, though, is might it prevent ALS in people who are at a high risk of it? So there are some population studies that suggest that it might reduce the risk of ALS in a population as a whole. So sometimes I get patients in my clinic who are family members of a person I took care of who passed from genetic ALS. And they say, you know, we've got the mutation. What can we do? Well, first and foremost, hopefully they can get into a trial. There's now some trials opening for people to try to prevent them from getting ALS. Like, for example, the Atlas trial, which is using tofersen. But if they have a different mutation or they can't get into that trial, then one of the things I say is, you know, vitamin E is pretty safe, and it is associated with a couple of population studies saying that, you know, it might reduce the risk of ALS. So for someone who's got a mutation and no symptoms, I personally think that's a reasonable thing to try. With other vitamins, vitamin C, no evidence of benefit. In fact, it's been studied, it didn't work. And I haven't seen, you know, anything on things like vitamin A or vitamin K. So those would not be near the top of my list.
And you just mentioned in your presentation one concept that I wasn't aware of and pretty much blew my mind, neurophoresis. It looks like a totally different approach. We're not talking here about a pharmaceutical company. We're pretty much talking about cleaning people's CSF, which is,
Right.
It sounds like science fiction.
Yeah, it does. And I bet, you know, when somebody first proposed plasmapheresis, filtering the blood, which is now like a routine therapy for a lot of different diseases, they thought the same thing. Like, you're gonna run someone's blood through a filter and put it back in. Yeah, but now it's routine. And I think, you know, there's a really good chance that neurophoresis would get approved someday for subarachnoid hemorrhage, for the bleeding into the spinal fluid. If it does, it will become a lot easier for us to do a trial in ALS. But, you know, one of the very first things that we have to try to answer in the trial, we now know that we can filter products that look plausibly related to the progression of ALS, and that we can, you know, reduce the toxicity, at least in animals. But we don't know how long the effects last. Like, let's say I bring a person in and I filter their spinal fluid, I filter it all, you know, over 24 hours. And the next day, it's right back to where it was before. That's not going to be a very plausible treatment for ALS. It's going to have to last, I would think, at least a week, the effects. Because, I mean, this is a pretty big deal to bring someone in, to insert this catheter, you know, to filter them. It's not something that would easily be done at home. You're going to have to go somewhere, you know, probably get admitted somewhere where you can be monitored. Because, I mean, there's a tube sticking out of your spinal fluid. And, you know, that thing really can't be moved around much. You could cause pain. You could cause injury to the nerve roots. You could cause an infection if this is not done, you know, very cleanly. So it's a risky therapy. But I mean, if it can reduce these molecules for at least a week, and ideally, hopefully even longer, hopefully for a month or more, then I think it's something that could be added to a cocktail of things for people, you know, pills that reduce glutamate and oxidative stress and improve mitochondria and endoplasmic reticulum, and then maybe also spinal fluid filtration to reduce neuroinflammation. I could see it being part of a cocktail someday.
And 2022 is going to be remembered as the year where we got our drug number 3 for ALS. We have recently received the news that AMX0035 was approved in Canada and in the US. And you mentioned in your presentation that you were positively surprised about the way this drug was approved, and it had a lot to do with patients advocacy. So what can you comment on that? It's definitely one of the best news we've had in the last years.
Yeah, I mean, as I get older, I look back over my career and I think about the amazing things that I've seen. Certainly a change in the way we take care of people with ALS, new products. But by far the biggest and most impressive change to me has been the power of patient advocacy. It started with recognizing that patients should be considered to be partners in everything that we do, not just subjects in our studies, but partners. And, I think some of the training programs that are out there, like our Clinical Research Learning Institute, where we bring patients in and we teach them about research. We give them the vocabulary and the knowledge that they need to be the most effective partners possible. And then every month we try to connect with the people who graduated from this program, which we call research ambassadors, and we show them places where they could influence the research process. And it might be fundraising, it might be changing laws, it might be working with individual researchers or sponsors, or it might be working with regulators. And if you think about the first statement from the FDA, when the company Amylyx approached them with AMX 0035 and said, this is what we got, we got a positive trial. First thing they said was, well, we don't even consider approving drugs until there's 2 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials. That was their official statement. Pretty sure it was like all the way back at the beginning of 2022. And patient advocates rose up and they demanded a hearing with the FDA. They demanded a hearing with Congress. And the net result of all that was eventually the FDA not only agreed to consider it, but approved it based on just one study. So they did a whole 180 from what they originally said. And I really believe it was the power of patient advocacy that changed their minds. And, I'm proud of the FDA that they could be flexible and change their minds, that they could understand, what a terrible disease this is and what a huge unmet need we have, and be a little flexible with, the bar that they set for approvals. I think the bar should be different. I mean, if you're talking about the 20th drug for migraine headaches, well, you can afford to wait for 2 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials. But if you're talking about a drug for a disease that's as terrible as ALS, I mean, I think people would rather see you err on the side of, possibly approving something that we find out in a few years, okay, it really didn't work. We thought it might, but now we know it doesn't. I mean, that mistake is not so bad. The mistake of just sitting around and saying, well, we're going to wait 2 or 3 years for a second trial. I mean, what if that trial is also positive? What if it also shows that this dramatically slows disability and prolongs life? Can you imagine how do you face those families, whose loved ones are more disabled or in some cases dead when they didn't need to be, because there was a drug that we thought might work and we were just too conservative to approve it. So I applaud the patient advocates, but also applaud the FDA for listening.
Excellent. So to wrap up this talk, we remember 2 years ago when you gave us that magnificent presentation about alternative therapies. You talk about something really, really important, which is those red flags that patients and families need to be aware of before considering any kind of alternative therapy. And we've been sharing those red flags, that portion of that of your presentation. We've been sharing that with patients and families here in Argentina, but also with journalists and media when they do this, and when they interview us and they ask us about different alternative therapies, or a couple of famous or notorious cases that we had here in Argentina. We always share that part of the video when you talk about these red flags. So can you refresh that for us? Can you refresh this concept? And what are the I believe there were 10, but I don't know,
Yeah.
maybe they were less than that. What are the red flags that we need to consider before going through an alternative therapy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I use it all the time too. And the reason I use it all the time is every time I publish one new ALS Untangled review of a product, it seems like I get a dozen new ideas. There's no end to the number of products, the number of clinics that are popping up online on social media, many making extraordinary claims of effectiveness and safety without actually publishing any data. And so what I tell my patients is, look, I've not heard of this before. I don't know that much about it, but let's run through the list of red flags and see how many we can see associated with this. And where we came up with this is, again, we've been doing this a long time now, and we found some products that look promising, which we've talked about, a whole bunch of products which didn't look promising at all. And we tried to figure out, like, what are some of the things associated with the less promising products that we could apply to new ones before we get to do a full review. And I probably won't remember the whole list of 10, but I'll tell you some of the more common ones that I see. So first is, whatever someone's proposing, it should have a plausible mechanism. So I mean, if someone is claiming, that if they wave a branch over your head, they can heal you of ALS. Well, there's no plausible mechanism by which waving a branch over your head would cure ALS. There's no law of biology or physics where any kind of healing force can come out of a piece of wood to change the pathophysiology of a brain and spinal cord disease. And again, sometimes that's hard for a person who's non-scientist, but that's one of the things that doctors can do with their patients is if a patient brings something up, look at what this thing is supposed to do and see if there's any plausible way that it might help a person with a disease like ALS. The second is this product or clinic claiming that they can, improve or cure many of the world's worst diseases, which have nothing in common. It's quite rare in my experience for someone to set up a website or a clinic just for ALS. And part of that is there's not enough people with ALS for the clinic to be able to make money. So, many times you'll see on some of these websites, 30 different diseases, which have nothing in common. Not only ALS, but they have things like, brain tumors and lung cancer and prostate cancer and fibromyalgia and diabetes. I mean, these things, they don't have anything in common. So there's no way that one therapy could possibly work for all these things. So that's a huge red flag. Next is, who is the person that's in charge of this therapy? Is this a person that is a doctor, a medical doctor? Is a person who's got some scientific background? Have they published anything? I mean, if this is a person who, was a real estate agent and an accountant, and now they're running a clinic and telling you, that by injecting you with something, they can reverse your ALS, that makes no sense. Where would they have gotten the idea? How would they know that this thing actually works? I mean, it's just implausible that someone with no medical or scientific training would find a treatment that really works for ALS. Next is there any kind of oversight at the clinic? Like, does the FDA know about this? Is there an IRB involved? Is there a data safety monitoring board? Is there a consent form? If a person is just asking you to come and they can't answer any of those questions, I'd be worried because, legitimate research has multiple layers of oversight. And some people look at that as a negative. And certainly it means that research takes longer. But the positive is that your safety is being optimized by all this oversight. So, I mean, the FDA looks at protocols and they'll make suggestions if they think there's something in there that could make it safer. The IRB and the DSMB, they're constantly looking at the study in real time. And if they see that there's something happening that they think patients should know about, they will make you change the consent form and notify all the patients so that they're fully aware of what their risk is. DSMBs might even shut a study down if they see that there's a horrible amount of harms happening and really no evidence of benefit. They might shut it down before the study ends. And you saw that happen in one of the arms of the Healy platform trial, one of the first arms the complement inhibitor, zilucoplan, was shut down, before the study reached its completion because it didn't look like there was any chance of benefit. And there was the possibility that people were going to suffer harms. If all that doesn't exist, be worried. Is the clinic actually measuring anything? We found examples where clinics, especially stem cell clinics, on their websites will say, we've seen evidence of benefit. Well, ask them, what evidence of benefit? Because a lot of times what happens is you go there, you pay them your money, you get your injection, and they never see you again. So how do they know there's evidence of benefit if they're never seeing the patients back again? And if the evidence of benefit is, well, we call people a week later and we say, how you doing? Oh, you're doing better. Okay, good. Check that off as someone who benefited from the therapy. That's not evidence of benefit. There should be things being measured. Next is those things should be reported. Science advances through the reporting of results of measurements that are made in studies for what's called peer review. Reporting information on Facebook does not count. That is not a legitimate place for science to be reported and discussed. Science is presented at meetings, and meetings are wide open. You can be anyone, and you can submit an abstract to a meeting, and you'll probably get accepted at least to present a poster. And at that poster, you can show the world what it is that you're doing and what your measurements are. And scientific peers, people who've been doing this all their lives, can weigh in and give you feedback. Is this really something interesting? How could you make these results, more solid, more credible, more believable? And maybe they would even help you take it into a better designed study. In my experience, the scientific community is very open to collaboration, especially in ALS. And so if someone is not putting themselves out there, going to meetings, presenting data for scientific peer review, be very worried. And then, last but not least, if someone is telling you to divorce your doctor and just let them take care of you, especially if they're not even a medical person, be very worried. We see this on the absolute worst of the worst products, where people are just, insulting the entire medical and scientific community and advising patients to divorce from it and follow their bizarre, roadmap. Even though we don't have the answer today, we do have a lot of things that can help to make your life better, longer, keep you out of the hospital, help your family with the caregiver burdens. There's a lot of things we can do. And, we don't want you to divorce from us and lose out on all those benefits. Most of us will work with you with an open mind. And, we're not going to divorce you because you decide to do something that we don't agree with. We just want you to hear us and make sure that you're fully informed before deciding what you're going to try. That's all.
And if I may add one more red flag that you mentioned 2 years ago, if anyone is asking you to pay up front for an experimental therapy, that's something to worry about, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. I knew I was going to forget at least one of them on the list because I didn't have it in front of me, but no, you're absolutely right. In my opinion and the opinion of many, it is not ethical to charge people a large sum of money for an unproven treatment. In a research study, in a legitimate research study, you are not asked to pay for the product or for the evaluations. There is a budget that the researchers get from a grant or from a person who owns a product to study it. Even nowadays, many trials will reimburse you for your expenses for traveling back and forth. But if someone's out there, telling you if you just pay them $20,000 or $30,000, they can reverse your ALS, huge red flag.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Richard. That was incredible. That was excellent. Thank you again for sharing your very valuable time with us. This will be super helpful for our community. We are followed not only in Argentina, but also in the whole Spanish-speaking community around the world for ALS. So we will be editing and subtitling this, and then we're going to share it with you and with the rest of the world. How's that?
Fantastic. I'm glad to partner with you anytime. Hopefully one of these years I'll be able to actually come and visit you in person. That would be great.
You are invited. You are invited here.
Hopefully travel is going to start getting easier here now.
Hopefully, yeah. Okay, Richard, thank you so much again. And we'll be in touch as always.
All right. Have a good week.
You too. Bye bye. Take care.
Bye bye. Yep.